Hey, Jessica, I brought you back to the show because you have so much incredible guidance for us, not just with imposter syndrome, but with your book and how to reframe our inner voice. So, we were
Mhm.
just in the green room again, and I'm so excited to have you back on the show. We were talking about something you coined the imposter cycle.
Mhm.
Let's lean into that a little bit further and explain what that means.
Yeah, so the first time I came across Imposter Cycle was by Dr. Jessamy Hibbard. This was a few years ago. She had written a book called The Imposter Cure. And so what I ended up doing was I developed that out to something because if you're not experiencing imposter syndrome, I also renamed it to high achiever with a loud inner critic. So it's called the hack cycle. And the reason why it's
Mm,
a hack cycle is I then created 6 checkpoints along the way where you can then step in to slowly start to make those changes. And then you're hacking the cycle at the end of the day, which is what I really appreciate
awesome.
with it. And when my goal with anything, with whether you're creating intentions, you're building a business, you're stepping into a leadership role, or you're understanding how you're choosing to reframe your voice, you can reverse engineer anything. And so with
Mm,
the hack cycle, we get to reverse engineer it so then that way you're giving yourself those checkpoints at different stages. So let's talk about when that inner voice usually comes up. Comes up if you're trying something new, if you're in an obstacle, a challenge, someone's put you in on the spot and now you're starting to get frantic, you're
yeah.
applying for that promotion, you're putting together a pitch, whatever it may be, it's you're all of a sudden starting in and that initial thought comes up. So that's the first part, the initial thought. And let's just say that it's the I don't know.
Okay.
That I don't know then activates your flight or fight response inside of you. And that's
Mm,
the discomfort that you start to feel. It could be butterflies in your stomach. It could be you starting to sweat profusely. I've even had one of my clients describe it as ants in their pants.
yeah.
So it shows up differently for everyone. So there's that body discomfort. Okay. So that's number two. Number three in the cycle is it then activates your inner critic.
Wow.
So, what you can do, take a moment, think about the top 3 things that you say to yourself on a regular basis. And what are those top 3 things? Is it something that's more negative or is it
Mm.
something that is more positive? And so that inner critic usually comes up with, you're not good enough. You can't do that. Why do you think that you should be the one to do this?
Right.
Whatever your inner dialogue is. And I had actually posted on social media asking my audience, what is it that your inner critic says? And the comments that people shared, it could be
Wow.
anything from, I'm not lovable
Oh
to
boy.
I'm never going to be able to get to that position. Why me? And
Mm.
when that inner critic gets activated, as that high achiever, it is so easy to have then that drive for perfection.
Yeah.
And that drive for perfection gives us the opportunity to set unrealistic expectations for ourselves. And in the last episode, we talked about linking our self worth to the ability to achieve. And that's where
That's
that
right.
drive from perfection comes in. Now, our work styles, because of that drive, happen in one of 2 ways. One, we either overwork to the point of exhaustion, spreading ourselves too thin, or
Yeah.
we avoid or procrastinate, not
Right.
because we're lazy, but because of that uncomfortable feeling that showed up for us. And because it's so uncomfortable, we think, you know what, I'll just put it off until a different time so I don't have to experience it. Now,
Yeah.
the person who's the high achiever with a loud inner critic is successful no matter what at the end of the day.
No kidding.
Yes. So what ends up happening is you get to that success, regardless of your work style, regardless of the drive for perfection and how angry that process was. However, the link that ends up connecting and starting the cycle all over again is you end up discounting that success.
Ah,
So the question that I usually ask people in my workshops is how long, because we know when discomfort shows up and it can last a really long time.
it's physical. We're talking about
It's,
physical discomfort.
yep. How long does that feeling of success actually last?
What a
And
great
I
question.
right? I have people who say 30 seconds until until the next thing. The longest I've had someone say is maybe 24 hours.
Wow.
So we spend
Wow.
all this time as that high achiever sitting in this discomfort And we just go about repeating the cycle again because we discount it. We don't give ourselves the opportunity to process our work. So what ends up happening is if we overworked and stretched ourselves too thin, we look back at it and we think, well, this was Surmount's level of energy. I'll never be able to do that again or repeat it. So I can't do it.
Right.
So right there, that inner critic, it gives just more information to our inner
More
critic
fuel.
to use against
Yep.
us. Yep.
Yep.
If we avoided, we look back at it and we think, oh, well, it was because I was lucky. It was a last ditch effort. It's there are a select set of people, because you avoided it, that it gives you the excuse that, again, I can't repeat it because it was just in that moment that I was able to. Yes.
It was a fluke. Wow.
And that's really hard because now every time you take a turn on that cycle, you keep digging a deeper, darker hole, and it's harder to get out of.
This is a real thing.
Yeah, this is why it's not just necessarily the imposter cycle, because if you experience imposter syndrome, that's a part of it. However, if you're not necessarily relating to imposter syndrome, but you're still that high achiever, it's because of that loud inner critic that you experience the hack cycle.
Yeah.
And so the key checkpoints to be able to navigate through is,
please.
The first one is paying attention to how it shows up in your body.
Okay.
And now when you get to label it, so let's say you're having a conversation, a difficult conversation with a colleague, an employee, or your employer. And anytime that person's name comes up in your email, it activates that response inside of you because you don't know what that conversation is going to be like or what you're going to enter into. Now you get to understand, oh, this flight or fight response that has been activated, it's not because I really am in danger and I need to move and get out of the way. It's this individual, this conversation is going to make me feel uncomfortable. So this topic in general, I know creates this physical sensation in me. So that's checking in with your body. That's the first one.
Check in with your body. First one. Okay.
The second one is paying attention to how you choose to speak to yourself. So that reframe that you had mentioned, taking it from inner critic to inner cheerleader or inner sage or inner wise person, whatever name you want to call it, but it's starting to reframe those words. How are you choosing to speak to yourself? What are you saying? Is it time of the day? Who are you around? Start to ask yourself and start to change. So those top 3 things that you take a look at to see what you're saying to yourself, how do you go about reframing it?
To your inner BFF.
I love that. It's your inner BFF. Yes.
Your inner BFF. That's what we want to reframe to. So pay attention to what's going on in your body and now talk to yourself as if you're your best friend.
Yep.
Right?
Third checkpoint is that striving for perfection, you're going to actually reset your expectations with realistic goals.
Okay.
So this gives you the opportunity to strategize and break down. So when you go back to evaluate, you're not then condemning yourself because of that little bit of failure or the mistake that happened. It's you going back and being able to reflect. So in that moment, you get to reset your expectations. Okay.
Got it.
Body check, our voice, the inner BFF.
Yep.
And now we're resetting our expectations. The fourth, and this is what we also talked about, I'm going to tap onto it from our last episode, is creating boundaries.
Creating boundaries.
It's overworking or avoiding. And you get to put timelines in because the 2 things that are finite that you can't get back are time and energy.
That's right.
So you get to give yourself the opportunity to create boundaries in how you choose to work. Set time blocks. So then if you are someone who avoids, strategize with when you're going to do it. Instead of our subconsciously consistently working, and even though we put it off, we're still thinking about it in the background.
That's right. It's still there.
It's still there.
Yeah.
And then the 5th checkpoint is when you step into that success, you get to own it. You have to acknowledge it, not just once, not not just twice. There's something called savoring success. When you savor success, you get to give yourself permission to remind yourself of your capabilities, your strengths, your skills, and your knowledge. So, a way that I like to teach people how to savor their success is to create an alternative resume. This is an investment container that you get to
Mm,
build in. So, it's not your resume that you send out to everyone,
right?
but it's your resume of your characteristics, of the things that you know that you're good at that you wouldn't usually share, but you have to remind yourself that you're good at.
That's right.
And that the sixth checkpoint to round it out, which is the hardest, is what is that initial statement that you end up saying to yourself that ends up turning into that domino effect and having you take a turn on the cycle.
Oh,
So, usually, when you start to hear that inner critic voice, people start to get angry at themselves, thinking,
right.
oh, I've done the work already. Why is this coming up again? I can't believe that I didn't catch it this time. So instead of getting angry at yourself, because that is going to be the hardest, you get to understand first the first 5 checkpoints, how to
Right.
make those changes, and then
Right.
eventually you'll be able to prep for. So let's say that you now know that person who sent that email, that's going to be maybe a trigger point or something that gets activated inside of you.
Right.
When you get specific and start to understand, then it doesn't have to keep you stuck or overwhelmed or thinking that you can't.
Wow. That's an incredible cycle to keep in mind. What I love is it's just a cycle, it's a moment in time, right? And
Mm-hmm.
with your suggested changes and considerations, we can just about stop the cycle of self-criticism in its tracks, right?
Exactly.
Because the end point is to not get to that beginning point again, right? The end should
Exactly.
be the end, right? So,
Yeah.
but I love there were so many interesting things, but I love, to be able to savor your success. Something that I've started with this year that I want to share, and it came up on a previous episode where there was this particular successful individual, and they asked him, how did he scale his business so successfully? And he said every day he starts his day off by reading his testimonials, right? Reading, like feeding our mind with that, like you said, the characteristics, right,
Yeah.
of what makes us whole. So if there's, let's be creative with all of this feedback and just have it right here in our space to remind ourselves of our
Mm-hmm.
capabilities. So I love your cycle. I love how we can end the cycle, right? I love how we were
Yeah.
able to, how you wrapped it up. And this is in your book, correct, Jessica?
This is in my book, yeah. And so I'll send you over the worksheet that the listeners can then take a look at. So then they can actually check in with themselves to see, okay, what is happening to me at certain parts? Because some people that I work with, they're like, well, I don't have a drive for perfection. I don't need to
Yeah.
reset those expectations. But there
Yep.
is an issue with overworking or avoidance. And why are you avoiding it? Is it something that you've taken out on yourself because you're not good at it and you define it as a
Right.
weakness? Or is
Right.
it something that you need to outsource now because you
Right.
shouldn't actually be doing it a part of your role? And so this gives you the opportunity to go about exploring it. When you acknowledge, and I appreciate immensely the example that you used about reading the testimonials, that investment container needs to be that alternative resume that you are putting money into. Think of it like a piggy bank for a rainy day. So
Exactly.
even on good days, you should still be putting investments into it because what ends up
That's right.
happening, and even though it feels silly or you think, oh no, this isn't going to actually work, on those bad days when you've had a really crappy sleep or you've had that difficult conversation or something's come up, you
Right.
get to pull and draw on that investment. But you
That's right.
actually have to put something into it first.
Yep. Yep. It's your emotional bank account, right?
Yeah,
Let's
that's
make
exactly
ourselves
it.
rich with that. And what I also, because what happens with the negative self-talk, sometimes it's what other people have said to us, which is not true. And we hold on to that,
Yes.
right? We're like, well, this person said, or I got the, implication that they don't like the way I do certain, or maybe they're in a toxic environment. It's always coming back to who we are and where our strengths are and, you know, not fixing it, but reframing it from there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not
Exactly.
just, what we have going on, but what we have going on could be a large part of what people have told us. And for whatever reason, we start to believe it.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly. When you start to examine that inner critic voice, key question that you can ask yourself is, who comes up? Who do I see
Mm,
when I hear that voice? Because if it did come from someone else, then that's not actually your inner critic,
that's
right?
it.
That is actually someone else's that you have now taken and thought it had to become your inner critic. Now, our inner critic actually comes into fruition because it's a form of protection. It's a way
Yes.
that we have protected ourselves and kept ourselves safe for a very long
Yeah,
time. However, you get to thank it and send it on its way. It
that's
doesn't
right.
have to be the only voice you hear.
Right. Right. I love it. This has been so fantastic. I so appreciate your time again, Jessica. Let's remind the listeners if they wanted to reach out to you, where's the best place for them to
Mhm.
find you?
They can find me on LinkedIn under the name Dr. Jessica Metcalfe or on my website at www.drjessicametcalfe.com.
Excellent. I will put both links in the show notes to make it nice and easy because this has been so rich with information and how to talk to ourselves better today. Thank you so much for your time and all the work that you do.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Of course.